You'd think there's a limit to what the human body can take, right? A point where pain is so overwhelming, it's supposed to be over. But for some people in history, that limit wasn't an end. It was a statement. In the brutal early days of the Christian faith, just being a believer made you a target. And if you were a leader, you basically had a death sentence hanging over your head. The stories of their final hours are not for the faint of heart. They are records of cruelty that's hard to even imagine, designed to break not just the body, but the soul itself. We're told they were roasted alive, flayed like animals, and torn apart by machines of pure agony. Today, we're looking into these gruesome legends of martyrdom. We'll explore the horrific punishments they faced, and try to separate the shocking truth from the embellished tales that have echoed through the centuries. So, why was this happening? To get it, you have to picture the Roman Empire. The empire saw this new Christian religion not as a spiritual movement, but as an act of rebellion. Christians refused to worship the Roman gods and the emperor, which was basically treason. Emperors like Nero, Decius, and Diocletian unleashed waves of persecution, turning a simple act of faith into a crime punishable by death. And the goal wasn't just to execute people, it was to make an example of them. Public tortures were psychological warfare, meant to scare other Christians into giving up their faith. But this plan, it backfired big time. Instead of breaking the faithful, it created legends. It forged saints in the fires of suffering, and their stories of endurance became more powerful than any emperor's law. Let's start with fire, a classic tool for purification and for total destruction. For the Romans, it was a popular way to execute someone and put on a terrifying public show. And no story illustrates this better than that of Saint Lawrence. Lawrence was a deacon in 3rd century Rome, under the rule of Emperor Valerian. In 258 AD, the emperor ordered all bishops, priests, and deacons to be executed on the spot. After the pope was killed, the Roman prefect came for Lawrence, demanding he hand over all the church's treasures. Lawrence said okay, and asked for 3 days to gather everything. In that time, he gave away all of the church's money and valuables to the city's poor and sick. On the 3rd day, he showed up before the prefect, gestured to the crowd of impoverished people he'd gathered, and declared, "Here are the riches of the church." The prefect was enraged. He ordered the most painful death he could think of. According to the famous legend, Lawrence was sentenced to be roasted alive on a giant gridiron over a fire of hot coals. It was a slow, agonizing death meant to cause as much suffering as possible. Yet, the stories say Lawrence handled it with an unbelievable calm. As the flames literally cooked him, he supposedly quipped to his executioners, "Turn me over, I am done on this side." It's an amazing story of defiance. But is it true? Most modern historians don't think so. They point out that the normal execution for clergy back then was a quick beheading, which is what happened to the Pope. The story of the gridiron might have come from a simple typo in a Latin text, where passus est, meaning he suffered, was mistaken for assus est, meaning he was So while the gridiron is probably a myth, his martyrdom isn't. St. Lawrence was killed for his faith, and his legend became a powerful symbol of courage and even humor in the face of tyranny. But the ordeal of fire wasn't just for men. In Sicily, a young noblewoman named Agatha dedicated her life to her Christian faith and took a vow of virginity. Her beauty caught the eye of a Roman official named When she rejected him, he had her arrested during a period of persecution. What happened next was a series of tortures meant to break her will and humiliate her. After being sent to a brothel, which she resisted, she was thrown in prison and horribly abused. The most infamous torture she suffered was the mutilation of her breasts. Legend says she was miraculously healed in her cell by a vision of St. Peter, which only made her captor even more furious. His final order was for her to be stripped and rolled over hot coals, mixed with broken pottery. She suffered through this last torment before dying in her prison cell, her faith completely intact. While Agatha's martyrdom is backed up by early Christian records, the specific details, like the mutilation, might be symbolic. In the stories of saints, these kinds of details were often used to emphasize themes of purity, fighting back against a brutal world. The truth of her suffering, however, is undeniable. If fire was a public spectacle, the blade, that was different. It was personal. And no story captures this intimate cruelty better than the martyrdom of Saint Bartholomew, one of the 12 apostles. Tradition says that Bartholomew traveled to Armenia as a missionary. He was so convincing that he converted the king Ptolemyus to Christianity. This enraged the king's brother Astyages, who ordered Bartholomew to be arrested and executed. The punishment he chose was one of the most gruesome you can imagine. Bartholomew was to be skinned alive before being beheaded. Art throughout history has not shied away from this horror. He is often shown holding his own skin, a grotesque symbol of what he endured. Michelangelo even famously painted Bartholomew's flayed skin with a self-portrait of his own face in the Sistine Chapel's Last Judgment. Is this historically accurate? Well, like with many of these stories, it's tough to say for sure. Early Christian sources agree he died violently for his work, but the specific detail about being flayed is based more in legend than hard evidence. Still, flaying was a real method of torture in the ancient world, used for people who were seen as a major threat. Whether fact or legend, the story of his flaying was a chilling reminder of the price of faith. The blade was also used for mutilation, as we saw with Saint Agatha. This kind of torture was about more than just pain. It was meant to dehumanize someone, to strip away their identity and dignity before killing them. For women like Agatha, the attacks were often symbolic, targeting their womanhood as a sick punishment for their spiritual beliefs. The Romans didn't stop with fire and blades. They were engineers, after all. And they engineered machines designed for one thing: pure agony. 2 saints are especially remembered for facing these mechanical horrors: St. George and St. Hippolytus. We all know St. George as the legendary dragon slayer, but his original story wasn't about a dragon. It was about his martyrdom in the early 4th century. George was a Roman soldier who openly declared he was a Christian and condemned the emperor's persecution. For this, he was put through a whole list of tortures. The most famous was the breaking wheel. This was a large wagon wheel, sometimes with spikes on it. The victim was tied to the wheel, and as it turned, their bones were broken and their body was ripped apart. The legends claim that when George was put on the wheel, it miraculously broke, and he was unharmed. He supposedly survived a bunch of other murder attempts too, before his captors finally just beheaded him. Now, the story of the wheel and the other miracles are almost certainly legendary additions. The dragon was also added to his story much later. These embellishments were created to turn him from a simple soldier who died for his faith into an epic hero or champion whose divine protection laughed in the face of Roman power. Just as horrific as the legendary death of Saint Hippolytus, a scholar who was martyred around the year 235 AD. We know he was real and that he was martyred, but the story of how he died is pretty dramatic. The most grisly version claims he was tied by his legs to wild horses, which were then spooked into a full gallop, dragging his body over rocks and thorns, until he was torn to pieces. Does that sound familiar? It should. It's shockingly similar to the Greek myth of Hippolytus of Athens, who was also dragged to his death by horses. It's very likely that the story of the saint's death got a dramatic upgrade over the centuries. borrowing from the famous myth to make it more memorable. Early sources don't say how he died, but the legend of the horses stuck, turning him into a symbol of being torn apart for your beliefs. The gridiron, the flaying knife, the breaking wheel, the brute force of wild horses. These stories paint a terrifying picture of what it could cost to stand by your convictions. So, how much is fact and how much is legend? We know that many of the most graphic details were likely added over the centuries to inspire, to horrify, and to strengthen people's faith. But the core truth is undeniable. Real men and women were persecuted and brutally executed for what they believed. The legends that grew around them became their own form of defiance, turning grim realities of torture and death into timeless tales of faith and incredible resilience. The memory of their suffering, whether it's historically precise or powerfully symbolic, has shaped history for 2,000 years. What do you think? Which of these stories did you find the most compelling or shocking? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this dive into the dark annals of history fascinating, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories that time has tried to forget. Thanks for watching.